As I grew up, I did come across more representation, more diverse characters, more diverse authors, but it still felt like something was missing. So I've always loved reading and writing. I've written ever since I was sort of early teens, and that comes from having a love of reading. And I remember I would write all of these stories and try to enter these competitions. I didn't always win, but it kept me going. And unfortunately, I lost that when I got to university. But I was lucky enough to sort of get back into it a few years ago, just before lockdown. I started with short stories, and then once lockdown came, I decided to give myself the chance to just write freely and write what felt true and honest to me. And then the book was born. I never used to actually enjoy reading when I was really young, so my mum was always quite worried about me when I was sort of 6 or 7 years old. I never liked reading or wanted to pick up a book, but then I fell into it, I guess. I think it takes the right book to change everything for you, and once I fell into it, there was no taking me back from it, to be honest. It got to the point where I was so obsessed with reading that my mum would confiscate my books instead of my phone, because she found that was a way to sort of handle me and my obsession with it. And I had so many heroes, actually. So I was a big fan of Malory Blackman. I think that was the first time I saw black characters be there in the story, like in the forefront. It was amazing. And then I loved, just your Cassandra Clares and, the Shadowhunter series. I loved John Green. I think everyone loves John Green. I actually, thinking back on it now, I did love a lot of American authors. I don't think I read as many British authors growing up. But yeah, I have so many fond memories of reading young adult books, and that was certainly something that, when I started writing, there wasn't any choice for me to write a young adult book, really. So You Think You Know Me is a young adults book. So it's for teenagers and for young adults, and it is a contemporary book, which means it's based on real life events, and it's based on characters who are from where I'm from, so northwest London. And the story follows a girl called Hanan. She's a 17-year-old teenager who attends a school called Grafton Grammar, and it's really about her struggles in dealing with the discrimination and the Islamophobia she faces every day at school, and how she overcomes that to eventually find her voice in dealing with things like Islamophobia or just general bullying. I think a lot of people will see themselves in Hanan and what she's had to face. And I think it's a very common experience to have for a lot of people, regardless of your background. You don't necessarily have to be Muslim to have the events in the book resonate with you, but also how you can overcome all of that and say what you want to say, even if it's so difficult. In the face of so much, you can find your voice, and you can find ways to find empowerment. I think that's a universal message, and I think for young people it's a really important message. Ultimately, it's a book with difficult themes, but there's hope at the end as well. So, alhamdulillah, I was lucky enough not to grow up facing the kind of Islamophobia Hanan faces on a daily basis. So I grew up in northwest London. I went to a very diverse school. I never felt out of place in my community. But that wasn't to say that I didn't feel out of place in society and the general messages that we're fed through media, through entertainment. So a lot of the book was processing all of that and trying to understand how my identity fits into all of that. And there are horrible instances of Islamophobia that you hear about all the time, more so after sort of terrorist attacks where the perpetrator is said to be Muslim. And I wanted to focus on that cycle because I think it's a cycle that many Muslims are familiar with all over the world. So I kind of wanted to dismantle that and show everything in its constituent parts, and how the hate really just comes alive after instances like that, and how that affects Hanan. But really, it's for Muslims all over the world. For me personally, is how I wanted it to resonate. Yeah, I think it was a really difficult choice to make, but ultimately, the character of the book was born for me more than the story was at first. there was a really tragic story of a Somali refugee called Shukri Abdi, who sadly died in Manchester a number of years ago. And hearing her story as someone who'd recently moved to the UK from a completely different country, a completely different system, and just seeing what she had to endure, for me, although it wasn't my experience, something in that really hit me quite deeply, and I carry that with me for around a year. I know a lot of people were deeply affected by that story, and then I started to think about what would it be like for her to come here to experience all of that bullying, really, as someone from a different country, but also as someone who is Muslim. So although I was born here, so I'm born and bred Londoner, it was difficult at times, but I think the story is much stronger for having that perspective. And my own parents as well came from Somalia and haven't been able to return for several decades now because of the war. So a lot of that was also drawn from my experience as well, from my family. I think speaking up is becoming more of an important topic to weave into children's books, and I think there are some arguments out there. There are some people who would argue that you shouldn't have young adult books that sort of try to teach young people, but I think it's really important to have that kind of style of writing in young adult books, because young people are quite impressionable, and one of the characters in the book, called Jessica, certainly harbours a lot of ill will towards Muslims because of what she hears from her family, and I think I wanted to show that perspective of someone who is spewing, a lot of dislike towards a certain group of people because of what they're being fed by outside sources, and then how someone is reacting to all of that. So you've got Hanan as well, who is dealing with all of this and has been, but really what changes in the book is that someone very close to her is murdered by a Muslim in what isn't a terrorist attack, but is sort of labelled as a terrorist attack as the book unfolds. And Hanan notices now something's different, and sometimes when you have a shift in your life, you realise what you've been doing for so long doesn't necessarily work, and actually what do you need to do now to change? Are you happy to accept things as they are and to accept the status quo, or is that becoming too uncomfortable? And do you realise actually your voice can make more of a difference for other people? At the time when I was reading all of this and absorbing all of these books from these amazing authors, I noticed now how it reflected in my writing, and my writing never featured characters who looked like me or my family or my friends. They looked like the characters in the books that I was reading, characters who I never really would have, character profiles that I never really would have interacted with in the real world. And that's not something I really understood at the time, but when I came to writing my own book, and I was writing my own characters onto the page and people who I felt very closely related to, the words flowed like in a way I never really expected they would have, and it was really freeing because I'd never been able to write a full story before then. I'd only ever written short stories here and there, and it felt like a monumental challenge, but one that was very much, it was made easier by the fact that I was writing something that felt so close to me. And as I grew up, I did come across more representation, more diverse characters, more diverse authors, but it still felt like something was missing. I was seeing more Muslim characters, even if they were American Muslims, which was amazing. It was great, but then then I start to think, okay, well, I haven't seen many Black Muslims being represented in literature, and actually I never see anything about my own culture, about Somalis being written onto the page in children's literature. So it was amazing, and it's something really special, I think, being able to write like the words of your language onto the page, and write the things that happen in your daily home and things that are part of your culture and everything onto the page. It's a really beautiful feeling, and I hope that a lot of people are able to connect to that. I would say have faith and think about your intention, because for me, making sure I had my intention straight made it easier for me to get from the beginning to end. I knew what I was doing and who I was doing it for, and that made the world of difference.